final years of the American Civil War and the Reconstruction era, Congress repeatedly debated the rights of millions of black former slaves. In 1869, amendments have been passed to abolish slavery and provide citizenship and equal protection under the laws. During the election of Grant in 1868, convinced a majority of Republicans that protecting the voting franchise of black voters was important for the party's future. Then Congress proposed a compromise amendment banning voting restrictions on the basis of race, color, or previous servitude. The 15th Amendment gave all men, regardless of race, the right to vote. This gave African Americans more power to guide their future than voting.
Jim Crow laws, the former practice of segregating blacks in the U.S. From the 1900s to 1965, most African Americans were not allowed to vote in the South. Whites used many different ways to keep out blacks from voting. First, they used violence. Blacks who tried to vote were threatened, beaten, and killed. Second, they used the literacy test. You had to be illiterate, so if you couldn't read, you could not vote. Finally, they used grandfather clause. People who could not read or own property were not allowed to vote. If their father or grandfather had voted before 1868, they were allowed to vote. Of course, practically no blacks could vote before 1867, so their grandfather clause only worked for whites. The Voting Rights Act, signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson on August 6, 1965, aimed to overcome legal barriers at the state and local level.
Women's suffrage was a 70-year battle. Without voting, there is no freedom. On June 4, 1919, women were given the freedom to vote. This was passed as the 19th Amendment. Groups like the NASA and the NWP supported the right to vote and led the 70-year battle to a victory. This was one of the most significant achievements for women in history. Today you will notice that women's votes matter a lot because Hillary's votes are a majority women, which is a big reason why Trump is behind in the race.
Lots of states have made things harder, especially for African Americans, students, elderly, and people with disabilities, and the right to vote. So the ACLU is trying to fight back against attempts to curtail an essential right in our democracy. In fact, the real problem we face in 2016 is almost exactly the opposite of what Donald Trump is complaining about. Officials in at least 5 states, including several key presidential battlegrounds, have been dragging their feet on obeying court orders to open up access to the polls.
Voter fraud is the illegal interference with the process of an election. Voter fraud is represented in many different forms. This includes double voting or ballot stuffing, meaning that one individual casts more than one ballot in the same election, and dead voters, meaning that someone casts a vote under the name of the deceased individual. Voter fraud isn't as common as one may think. For example, as America's presidential election day is approaching, Donald Trump has stated that he is worried about voter fraud and the interference with the casting of ballots. However, the incidents of voter fraud found so far have been deemed insignificant and have been resolved. It has become easier to prevent voter fraud and to check to see if deceased citizens are voting or if people are voting more than once. Nowadays, voting locations require citizens to meet certain standards in order to cast their vote. For example, voting administrators require people to bring a photo ID so they can keep track of who is voting.